Chapter 4. The Murder of Ishbosheth. Saul's son, Ishbosheth, heard that Abner had died in Hebron. His heart sank. The whole country was shaken. Ishbosheth had 2 men who were captains of raiding bands. One was named Baanah, the other Rechab. They were sons of Rimmon, the Beerothite, a Benjaminite. The people of Beeroth had been assigned to Benjamin ever since they escaped to Gittaim. They still lived there as resident aliens. It so happened that Saul's son, Jonathan, had a son who was maimed in both feet. When he was 5 years old, the report on Saul and Jonathan came from Jezreel. His nurse picked him up and ran, but in her hurry to get away, she fell, and the boy was maimed. His name was Mephibosheth. One day, Baanah and Rechab, the 2 sons of Rimmon, headed out for the house of Ishbosheth. They arrived at the hottest time of the day, just as he was taking his afternoon nap. They entered the house on a ruse, pretending official business. The maid guarding the bedroom had fallen asleep, so Rechab and Baanah slipped by her and entered the room where Ishbosheth was asleep on his bed. They killed him and then cut off his head, carrying it off as a trophy. They traveled all night long, taking the route through the Arabah Valley. They presented the head of Ishbosheth to David at Hebron, telling the king, "Here's the head of Ishbosheth, Saul's son, your enemy. He was out to kill you, but God has given vengeance to my master, the king, vengeance this very day on Saul and his children." David answered the brothers Rechab and Baanah, sons of Rimmon the Beerothite, "As surely as God lives, the one who got me out of every trouble I've ever been in, when the messenger told me, 'Good news, Saul is dead,' supposing I'd be delighted, I arrested him and killed him on the spot in Ziklag. That's what he got for his so-called good news. And now you show up? Evil men who killed an innocent man in cold blood, a man asleep in his own house? Don't think I won't find you guilty of murder and rid the country of you." David then issued orders to his soldiers. They killed the 2, chopped off their hands and feet, and hung the corpses at the pool in Hebron. But Ishbosheth's head they took and buried in Abner's tomb in Hebron. Chapter 5. Before long, all the tribes of Israel approached David in Hebron and said, "Look at us, your own flesh and blood. In time past, when Saul was our king, you're the one who really ran the country. Even then, God said to you, 'You will shepherd my people Israel, and you'll be the prince.'" All the leaders of Israel met with King David at Hebron, and the king made a treaty with them in the presence of God. And so they anointed David king over Israel. David was 30 years old when he became king, and ruled for 40 years. In Hebron, he ruled Judah for 7.5 years. In Jerusalem, he ruled all Israel and Judah for 33 years. David and his men immediately set out for Jerusalem to take on the Jebusites who lived in that country. But they said, "You might as well go home. Even the blind and the lame could keep you out. You can't get in here." They had convinced themselves that David couldn't break through. But David went right ahead and captured the fortress of Zion, known ever since as the City of David. That day, David said, "To get the best of these Jebusites, one must target the water system, not to mention this so-called lame and blind bunch that David hates." In fact, he was so sick and tired of it, people coined the expression, "No lame and blind allowed in the palace." David made the fortress city his home and named it City of David. He developed the city from the outside terraces inward. David proceeded with a longer stride, a larger embrace, since the God of the angel armies was with him. It was at this time that Hiram, king of Tyre, sent messengers to David, along with timbers of cedar. He also sent carpenters and masons to build a house for David. David took this as a sign that God had confirmed him as king of Israel, giving his kingship world prominence for the sake of Israel, his people. David took on more concubines and wives from Jerusalem after he left Hebron, and more sons and daughters were born to him. These are the names of those born to him in Jerusalem: Shemua, Shobab, Nathan, Solomon, Ibhar, Elishua, Nepheg, Japhia, Elishama, Eliada, Eliphalet. When the Philistines got word that David had been made king over all Israel, they came on the hunt for him. David heard of it and went down to the stronghold. When the Philistines arrived, they deployed their forces in Rephaim Valley. Then David prayed to God, "Shall I go up and fight the Philistines? Will you help me beat them?" "Go up," God replied. "Count on me. I'll help you beat them." David then went straight to Baal-perazim and smashed them to pieces. Afterwards, David said, "God exploded on my enemies like a gush of water." That's why David named the place Baal-perazim, the master who explodes. The retreating Philistines dumped their idols, and David and his soldiers took them away. Later, there was a repeat performance. The Philistines came up again and deployed their troops in the Rephaim Valley. David again prayed to God. This time, God said, "Don't attack them head on. Instead, circle around behind them and ambush them from the grove of sacred trees. When you hear the sound of shuffling in the trees, get ready to move out. It's a signal that God is going ahead of you to smash the Philistine camp." David did exactly what God told him. He routed the Philistines all the way from Gibeon to Gezer. Chapter 6. David mustered the pick of the troops of Israel, 30 divisions of them. Together with his soldiers, David headed for Baalah to recover the chest of God, which was called by the name God of the angel armies, who was enthroned over the pair of angels on the chest. They placed the chest of God on a brand new ox cart and removed it from Abinadab's house on the hill. Uzzah and Ahiel, Abinadab's sons, were driving the new cart loaded with the chest of God, Ahiel in the lead and Uzzah alongside the chest. David and the whole company of Israel were in the parade, singing at the top of their lungs and playing mandolins, harps, tambourines, castanets, and cymbals. When they came to the threshing floor of Nacon, the oxen stumbled. So Uzzah reached out and grabbed the chest of God. God blazed in anger against Uzzah and struck him hard because he had profaned the chest. Uzzah died on the spot, right alongside the chest. Then David got angry because of God's deadly outburst against Uzzah. That place is still called Perez Uzzah, the explosion against Uzzah. David became fearful of God that day and said, "This chest is too hot to handle. How can I ever get it back to the city of David?" He refused to take the chest of God a step farther. Instead, David removed it off the road and to the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite. The chest of God stayed at the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite for 3 months, and God prospered Obed-Edom and his entire household. It was reported to King David that God had prospered Obed-Edom and his entire household because of the chest of God. So David thought, "I'll get that blessing for myself," and went and brought up the chest of God from the house of Obed-Edom to the city of David, celebrating extravagantly all the way, with frequent sacrifices of choice bulls. David, ceremonially dressed in priest's linen, danced with great abandon before God. The whole country was with him as he accompanied the chest of God with shouts and trumpet blasts. But as the chest of God came into the city of David, Michal, Saul's daughter, happened to be looking out a window. When she saw King David leaping and dancing before God, her heart filled with scorn. They brought the chest of God and set it in the middle of the tent pavilion that David had pitched for it. Then and there David worshipped, offering burnt offerings and peace offerings. When David had completed the sacrifices of burnt and peace offerings, he blessed the people in the name of God of the angel armies, and handed out to each person in the crowd, men and women alike, a loaf of bread, a date cake, and a raisin cake. Then everyone went home. David returned home to bless his family. Michal, Saul's daughter, came out to greet him. How wonderfully the king has distinguished himself today, exposing himself to the eyes of the servants' maids like some burlesque street dancer. David replied to Michal, "In God's presence, I'll dance all I want. He chose me over your father and the rest of our family and made me prince over God's people, over Israel. Oh yes, I'll dance to God's glory, more recklessly even than this, and as far as I'm concerned, I'll gladly look like a fool. But among these maids you're so worried about, I'll be honored no end." Michal, Saul's daughter, was barren the rest of her life.